Think of a man sentenced to death. He knows the exact day he'll be executed. He may even know the hour. And even so, when the sun rises that morning, he gets up, makes coffee, eats his bread, and drinks it while it's still hot. Now I want you to hold that image for a second, because it seems absurd. Why eat if everything is going to end in a few hours? Why care about the temperature of the coffee? Keep that scene, because we're going to come back to it at the end of this video, and when we do, you're going to see something completely different. But before that, I need to tell you what keeps me up about this story. The difference between that man and you is far smaller than it seems. He knows the date. You don't. That's all. It's uncomfortable to think this way. I know. And most people look away when that idea gets close. But it's the fate of absolutely everyone who has ever breathed on this planet. And that's exactly where the question that probably brought you here is born. The one that appears out of nowhere in the middle of an ordinary day and disappears before you can answer it. If everything ends, why does it still matter? Why build something knowing that one day it will disappear? Why love someone you might inevitably lose? And I need to be honest with you before anything else, because I think you deserve honesty rather than cheap comfort. I don't have a neat answer to hand you. I don't know whether there's a plan behind all of this. I don't know what happens after death. And look, anyone who treats these questions as if they were simple, who gives you a ready-made answer in 30 seconds with a smile on their face, is probably ignoring precisely what's most difficult about them. I'm not going to do that to you. What I have to offer is better than a ready-made answer. I have what some of the most courageous minds in history discovered when they faced exactly this question head-on, without looking away. Albert Camus took it so seriously that he said it was the most important question in all of philosophy. Because before you think about success, about morality, about religion, about any grand idea, you need some reason to be on your feet tomorrow morning. And what he discovered, along with Viktor Frankl, Epicurus, the Stoics, and Nietzsche, completely changes how you'll look at your own time after today. Stay with me until the end, because there's a turn in this story almost nobody sees on their own. And before I take you into it, I need to ask something of you. And it isn't just any request, it's the first movement of everything that follows. There's a word that steals more life from people than any tragedy, and it's a harmless word you use every day without noticing. Later. Later when things settle down. Later, once I've solved that problem. Later, once I'm ready. Later, when there's money, time, courage. And what almost nobody notices is that this later never stays still. It always moves a little further ahead for an entire lifetime. So do this with me now. Before continuing, go down to the comments and write what you've been putting off until things settle down. Just one thing, and be honest. It could be a call to your father. It could be that apology you've been rehearsing for years. It could be starting over, leaving that job, booking that exam, telling someone how you feel. Write it, and pay attention to what happens in your chest when you see it written on the screen. Because a postponed thing that gets a name stops being comfortable. And now the most important part. After you write, scroll through the comments. Find someone who is putting off exactly the same thing you are, and write to that person just this. Me too. Let's stop putting it off together. That's all. 4 words. Because there's no greater force than discovering you're not the only one, and that there's someone on the other side of the screen stuck in exactly the same place as you. Now let me show you the map of what's ahead so you don't miss a single step, because this video is a construction, and each part holds up the next. First, we're going to understand what Camus called the absurd. that strange collision between our hunger for explanation and a world that simply doesn't answer. Then I'm going to dismantle a belief that's probably at the root of your anguish. The idea that something has to last in order to have value, and you'll see it can't stand up for 10 seconds. Next, we're going to meet Viktor Frankl, a man who lost everything it was possible to lose and still discovered where meaning is born. And he's going to invert the question you've been asking your whole life. We'll pass through the myth of Sisyphus and understand why Camus said we must imagine him happy, which sounds insane until you get it. We'll see what Epicurus and the Stoics discovered about the fear of death and about the real size of our problems. And at the end, most important of all, what Nietzsche called love of one's own fate, and the reason your later never arrives. Then we come back to the man drinking his coffee, and you'll see that scene with new eyes. Let's begin at the beginning, with the discomfort that probably brought you here. There's a strange conflict living inside you, and you've probably never been able to name it. On one side, you want explanations. You want to believe there's a reason behind the people you met, the choices you made, the losses you crossed, the things that changed your life out of nowhere. We're built that way. We're pattern and purpose-seeking machines. It's the most human thing there is. But on the other side is the world, and the world simply doesn't answer. Life just happens. Someone who should live dies young, and someone terrible lives 90 healthy years. A decision made in a rush defines 30 years of your life, and a decision agonized over for months changes nothing. You do everything right, and it goes wrong. You do everything wrong, and it works out. And nobody explains. Camus called this encounter between our hunger for meaning and the silence of the world the absurd. And notice he wasn't saying life is ridiculous. The absurd for him was exactly this encounter, this friction. It's like shouting a question inside an empty cathedral and getting back only the echo of your own voice. And the most interesting part is that you've already felt this, even without knowing its name. Because it almost never arrives in dramatic moments. It isn't in a tragedy that you notice the absurd. It's in the middle of a completely ordinary day. You're at work, doing the same thing you did yesterday, or washing dishes, or stopped in traffic, staring at the car ahead, and suddenly, with no warning, that question cuts through. What for? What is all this for? It lasts 3 seconds, leaves an emptiness in your stomach, and goes away. And you go back to what you were doing. That's the exact moment Camus was talking about, and almost everyone has had it, but almost nobody talks about it. And do you know why nobody talks about it? Because it's far too easy to run from that question these days. There's always a screen to look at. There's always something to buy, to finish, to organize, to watch. There's always a new goal to chase that promises to silence that question for a few more months. And so you chase it and reach it, and the question is still there, waiting. Because certain questions don't leave just because we look away. They stay. So maybe it's worth facing them once, head on, rather than running from them for the next 40 years. And look at what happens when people finally face it, because they generally choose one of two ways out, and Camus rejected both. The first is to give up. It's concluding that if there's no definitive answer, then nothing is worth it, and from then on the person merely walks through the days, dimmed, waiting for time to pass. It's a kind of death before death, and unfortunately it's more common than it seems. Some people do this for decades and nobody notices because they keep going to work, keep smiling in photos. The second way out is the opposite, clinging desperately to any ready-made answer, whatever it may be, just so they don't have to bear the uncertainty. Any explanation will do, as long as it silences the anguish. And Camus considered that dishonest, a kind of philosophical suicide. because the person is lying to themselves for comfort. He proposed a third path, and that path has a strong name, revolt. And here the word has a very specific sense, which isn't anger and isn't protest. Revolt, for him, is accepting that a definitive answer may never come, and continuing to live anyway, eyes open, without waiting for the universe to explain everything before you begin living. And I want you to feel the size of that idea, because it's braver than it first appears. It's like someone who discovers they won't be given the map and decides to walk anyway. Not because they're certain of the destination, but because the walk is still theirs. Notice the difference between that and silly optimism. Camus isn't telling you to think positive, isn't saying everything has a hidden purpose, isn't selling you hope. He's saying something much harder and much more respectful of you. Perhaps there is no explanation, and your life is still yours to live. You don't need the universe's permission. And here's where I need to prepare you for the next part, because there's a belief lodged in your head, probably since childhood, that's at the root of all this anguish. An idea so obvious that nobody ever questions it. It's the idea that something has to last in order to have value, that if it ends, it wasn't worth it. And I'm going to show you, with examples you already know, that this idea can't stand for 10 seconds. When it falls, and it will, death will stop looking like the final argument against life. Come with me. When we think that death makes life meaningless, there's a hidden assumption behind that reasoning, and it's almost never examined. The assumption is this: something has to last in order to have value. If it ends, it wasn't worth it. And I want you to test that idea right now against your own life, because it collapses in seconds. A song ends. Would you say that hearing the song that gave you chills was worth nothing because it lasted 4 minutes? An excellent meal ends. Was it useless because you finished the plate? Friendships from your teens ended, and you learned from them, laughed with them, became who you are partly because of them. Were they worthless? A sunset disappears in front of you in 15 minutes, and still we pull the car over to watch. None of it lasts, and none of it is useless. So the belief doesn't hold. And here comes the part that may flip the whole thing for you. In many cases, it's precisely the opposite. You pay attention to the sunset exactly because you know it's going to vanish. If it were frozen in the sky for 3 years, you'd stop seeing it within a week. Let me take that to the extreme, because it's at the extreme that it becomes clear. Imagine a song that never ended. Not a long song, a literally infinite song, playing for the rest of eternity. Would it still be beautiful? No. It would become background noise, and then it would become torture. The beauty of a song lies entirely in its structure, and structure means beginning, development, and end. Without the end, there's no form. Without form, there's no beauty. Now apply that to your life honestly. Imagine you were truly immortal, with infinite time at your disposal. Why would you start anything today? You could leave that project for next century. You could apologize 50 years from now, once you were better with words. You could visit that person later, say what you feel tomorrow, start living next year. There would always be another day. And the result wouldn't be an infinite, full life. It would be an infinitely postponed one, where nothing ever happens, because nothing ever has to happen now. Urgency would die. And with it, the significance of every choice. Because it's the limit that gives things weight. And that's a hard but liberating truth. Your time weighs precisely because it passes. A conversation can be postponed, yes, but not indefinitely. People age, and the window in which you could have said that thing closes. Relationships change shape, and the version that existed 10 years ago no longer exists. Opportunities disappear. And there are moments that once they pass, simply cannot be rebuilt, no matter how much money, willingness, or regret you have. You can't go back and be present at a birthday 10 years ago. You can't go back and call someone who no longer answers. And that's exactly what turns ordinary choices into important ones. If everything could be redone infinitely, nothing would be decisive. And a life with nothing decisive is a life without weight. So notice the turn. Death doesn't have to strip life of value. It's precisely that limit that can make your time so valuable. The fact that you have a finite number of mornings is what makes each morning a morning, and not just another one. And there's a specific reason you feel that nothing matters, and it has nothing to do with the truth about life. It has to do with the distance you're looking from. Let me show you. When we think about death, about the distant future, about the fact that in 100 years almost everything we do will have disappeared without a trace, we're looking at our own life from an absurd altitude. And from that altitude, it really does look small. Everything looks small from that altitude. It's like looking at your house from an airplane window. From up there, it's just one indistinguishable dot among thousands of other dots. And you can't even be sure which one is yours. But it's inside that dot that your entire life exists. It's in there that there are conversations only you know about. People who make a difference precisely to you and to nobody else in the world. Hot coffee waiting in the kitchen. A song that reminds you of someone. The relief after solving a problem that consumed you for weeks. A night when you finally rested properly. None of that shows up from the airplane window. And the error isn't that life is small. The error is that you climb too high to look at it. But I'm not going to pretend this solves everything, because it doesn't. And promising that would be exactly the cheap comfort I said I wouldn't offer you. Recognizing that your time is limited is only half the path. You still have to decide what to do with it. Knowing that life ends doesn't explain why you should get out of bed tomorrow morning, especially on a day when you wake up with no desire at all. It's like someone telling you that you have a limited amount of money and not telling you what to spend it on. Limitation, on its own, creates urgency, but it doesn't create direction. And this is where most people get stuck, and stay stuck for years. They understand rationally that life is short, they put quotes about it on the wall, and they keep living exactly the same. Because the second piece is missing. And the second piece is an inversion of perspective that came from a man who discovered it in the worst place in the world. A place where any beautiful theory about life should have crumbled. It didn't crumble. And that's exactly why what he discovered carries so much weight. Viktor Frankl was a physician and psychiatrist, and during the Second World War, he was sent to concentration camps. He lost practically everything a human being can lose. He lost his freedom. He lost years of work. He lost people he loved. He lived surrounded by hunger, violence, and death, in a place designed precisely to erase every trace of humanity from people. And that's why what he observed there carries a weight no armchair theory ever could. Because in that environment, where any beautiful discourse about the meaning of life should have turned to dust, Frankl noticed something strange. Some people, even there, still found reasons to look toward the next day. And they weren't the physically strongest, weren't the most optimistic, weren't necessarily the most religious. They were the ones who had something waiting for them. A child they hoped to see again. A work they still wanted to finish. A person, a responsibility, some genuine reason to continue. And that, in the middle of that horror, made an observable difference. It was by looking at those people that Frankl realized something that completely changes how we ask the question. His realization was this. We're asking the question backwards. Your whole life you ask what life has to offer you. What is my purpose? What did I come here to do? What should I be doing? What is my calling? You wait for life to hand you an answer, as if it were going to pull you aside and explain. And Frankl inverted it all. He said we also need to ask what life is demanding of us, right now in this specific situation. Do you feel the enormous difference between those two postures? One leaves you seated, waiting. The other puts you on your feet, answering. One makes you a customer of existence. The other makes you a participant in it. And the most beautiful part is that this second question always has an answer. Always, even in the worst conditions. Because in the face of a loss, a difficulty, or even a completely ordinary day, there is always some possible choice about what to do next. And it's exactly in that answer, in your answer, that meaning begins to appear. Not before, not ready-made, not handed over, built by you, in the act of responding. And now I want you to apply this to your own life, because you've probably done it many times without realizing you were doing it. Maybe you never found a great mission capable of explaining everything. Maybe you look back and don't see any moment when the sky opened and someone told you what you came here to do. That's fine, but pay attention to this. You've probably cared for someone when you could simply have walked away. You finished something difficult, not because anyone was demanding it, but because you knew you had to finish it. You've done a job properly even when nobody was watching and nobody would notice the difference. You've stayed beside someone in a bad hour when it would have been more comfortable not to stay. Those choices seem too small to mean anything, and that's exactly why we don't count them. But they're precisely what gives a life its shape. Frankl realized that meaning doesn't have to arrive as a revelation, with trumpets and absolute clarity. It can emerge far more quietly from the way you respond to what happened to you. And there's an expectation that hinders more than it helps, and it must be dismantled carefully. The idea that meaning has to be grand. We grow up hearing about life's mission, about purpose, about legacy, about leaving a mark on the world. And those words are so big that they end up paralyzing us. A person looks at their ordinary life, with an ordinary job and an ordinary routine, and concludes they have no purpose at all, because nothing there looks worthy of a documentary. But notice the absurdity of that demand. If meaning existed only in extraordinary lives, then the overwhelming majority of human beings who ever lived would have lived in vain. A conclusion nobody can sustain while looking a real person in the eye. The truth is simpler and more generous. Meaning isn't a marble sculpture. It's a web of fine threads. It's in how you treat the people who work with you, in the patience you had on a day when you had no patience, in having shown up when you promised you would. Those things don't become stories, nobody applauds them, but they're what makes a life a life. And while we go looking for the sculpture, we let the web go unnoticed. And there's something profoundly liberating in this, if you let the idea truly land. Because if meaning were a ready-made thing, hidden somewhere, then there would be a real possibility of never finding it, of spending your whole life searching under the wrong stones. Many people live that way, with a constant sense of being late, of not yet having discovered what they came for. But if meaning is built in the response, then it's available today, now in the next decision you make, however small. You don't need clarity in order to start living meaningfully. You just need to respond well to the next thing life puts in front of you. And look how interesting. Because here Frankl and Camus, who were very different men, begin to meet. Neither one promises that the world will explain why you're here. Both refuse that consolation, and both place exactly the same responsibility in your hands. What are you going to do with the life you received? And for you to understand how far Camus took this, I need to tell you the story of a man condemned to the most useless work that has ever existed. In Greek mythology, there's a man named Sisyphus, and he received from the gods the cruelest punishment anyone ever imagined. It wasn't torture, it wasn't fire, it wasn't any of that. His punishment was this: to push an enormous boulder up a mountain, to the top. And when he finally gets there, exhausted, hands raw, the boulder rolls all the way back down. And he goes down and pushes again. Forever, no end, no victory, no point of arrival. Notice the specific cruelty of that punishment. Because it's ingenious, it isn't pain that destroys Sisyphus, it's futility. The gods understood that the worst human suffering isn't effort, it's effort that leads nowhere. And it's impossible to hear that story without a shiver of recognition, because there are people who wake up every day, do exactly the same things, pay the same bills, cross the same traffic, and go to sleep knowing that tomorrow it all starts over identically. Few images in all of history so well represent the feeling of a life without purpose. And it's precisely here that Camus does the strangest and most brilliant thing in all his thought. After describing that terrible punishment in detail, Camus ends his reflection with a line that sounds completely insane on first reading. We must imagine Sisyphus happy. Happy, the man condemned to push a boulder for eternity. And when I first read that, my reaction was irritation. And maybe yours is too. How could someone condemned to repeat the same task endlessly be happy? Isn't that romanticizing suffering? But then you understand the argument, and it takes you apart. Camus isn't saying the boulder is good. He's pointing to a very specific moment in the story, one almost everyone overlooks, that moment when Sisyphus walks back down the mountain to fetch the boulder again. On that descent, he isn't pushing anything. He's free for a few minutes. And it's there that he thinks. It's there that he fully recognizes his own condition. He knows the boulder will fall again. He knows there's no final victory waiting at the top. He knows everything, with total clarity, with no illusion at all. And even so, he keeps walking down to push. And it's exactly at that point that he stops being a victim. Because the instant Sisyphus sees his own condition with open eyes, without deceiving himself and without expecting a rescue, something changes ownership. The boulder is still the same. The mountain is still the same. The repetition is still the same. But the climb becomes his. The awareness is his. The choice is his. The way he faces it is his, and that the gods cannot take. And that's why Camus could imagine him happy, not because the punishment stopped being a punishment, but because a man who sees his own fate clearly and keeps walking is no longer being ruled by it. Now bring that into your life, because this is where it hurts, and this is where it frees. You have your boulder too. Everyone does. It's the routine that starts over, the bill that comes due again, the effort you redo every month without ever finishing. The question Camus leaves isn't how to escape the boulder, because nobody escapes. The question is, whose climb is it? And I need to say something here, because it's the difference between this thought and the cheap self-help circulating out there. This isn't accepting everything in silence, and it isn't pretending the boulder is light. Camus isn't asking you to smile while you suffer, nor to be grateful for the punishment. He's doing something far finer. He's separating two things we constantly confuse. There's what happens to you, and there's what you do with what happens. The first part, very often, you don't choose. You didn't choose the family you were born into. Didn't choose the illness that appeared, didn't choose the crisis that came, didn't choose the person who left. But the second part is yours, and it's always yours, even when it's small. And it's remarkable how that small space of choice changes everything, because it's what separates those who are run over by life from those who cross through it. Sisyphus didn't defeat the gods. He simply refused the role of victim, and that was victory enough. But if that idea still feels too grand and distant, stay with me, because now I'm going to bring it down to the scale of your daily life, with two ancient ideas that are impressively practical. Epicurus spent much of his life trying to understand one specific thing. Why does death frighten us so much? And he reached a conclusion that sounds like wordplay, but isn't. He said this: while you're alive, death hasn't arrived. And when it arrives, you won't be here to experience it. In other words, you and death will never actually meet. You'll never be in the same room at the same time. Let that land for a second, because the implication is enormous. It means a person can spend 40 years suffering in advance over an event that, when it finally happens, they won't be present to feel. It's a pain that exists entirely in the imagination. And I need to be honest, this doesn't make the fear disappear, and Epicurus didn't promise that. Fear of death is human and doesn't vanish with a logical argument, but it changes the place you look at it from, because much of that suffering isn't in the future, it's happening now, while you imagine the end. And then comes the question that really matters. Is it worth losing the present by thinking so much about death? And notice that this is a practical question, not a philosophical one. How much of your time truly is spent anticipating bad things that may never even happen? How many nights have you spent awake rehearsing conversations that never took place, imagining diagnoses that never came, predicting losses that haven't arrived? There's an old line that sums this up brutally. We suffer more in imagination than in reality. And the most perverse part is that anticipated suffering protects you from nothing. It doesn't prevent the loss. It doesn't prepare you better. It only charges the price of pain twice, once now in imagination, and again later when it actually happens. Epicurus wanted to avoid exactly that waste, because to him that's what it was, wasted life. Death will come when it has to come. And there's nothing you can do about that today. But until then, there's an entire life happening before it. There are mornings, there are conversations, there's food, there are people. And it's that life being devoured by the fear of something that isn't here yet. The Stoics took that same idea and did something different with it. Something that sounds morbid, but is surprisingly practical. They cultivated the remembrance that life wouldn't last forever, and they did it deliberately, every day. Not to depress themselves, quite the opposite. They used that remembrance as a ruler, an instrument of measurement. Because when you take seriously that your time is finite, something happens automatically to your perception of things. You start noticing how much time you spend on nonsense. That argument that consumed 2 weeks of you. That comment someone made that you chewed on for months. That family grudge that has lasted years and whose origin you can't even remember clearly. That pride keeping you from taking the first step. Put each of those on the scale of finite time and ask the Stoic question, which is one of the most useful questions there is. If my time is limited, is it really worth spending this much of it on this? And honestly, most of the time the answer is no, and you know it immediately. And here's a question that might take you apart a little. How many of the important moments in your life felt important while you were living them? Think calmly. Probably very few. Almost always we only notice afterward, looking back, recognizing with a tightness in the chest a phase in which we were happy without having the faintest idea that we were. That cramped first apartment, that job you thought was temporary, those afternoons at the house of someone who isn't here anymore, none of it seemed special at the time. It all just seemed like life happening, ordinary and unremarkable. And that's where the most silent trap lies. We spend our lives waiting for the important moments to arrive, when in fact they're happening now, disguised as ordinary days. Today is one of those days. This year is probably one of those years you'll remember 15 years from now with longing. And if that's true, and it is, then the question that really matters isn't when will my life start being good, but what am I failing to see right in front of me while I wait? So thinking about death doesn't have to be morbid. And this is where almost everyone gets it wrong. It isn't about becoming obsessed with the end. It isn't about living in anticipated grief. It isn't about anxiety. Quite the opposite. It serves to put things at their right size. It's a perspective corrector. And there's an enormous difference between two postures. A person who fears death lies shrunken, trying not to lose anything, and ends up not living. A person who remembers death lives larger, because they stop wasting time on what doesn't deserve it. The first uses death as a jailer, the second uses it as a counselor. And it's a choice, even if most people never notice their choosing. But now we reach the most important point of this entire video. The one I planted back in the introduction when I asked you to write in the comments. Because there's a thief of life far more efficient than death. A thief that kills nobody and still consumes entire decades. It works in silence, with your consent, every single day. And I'm almost certain it's at work in your life at this very moment. The thief is called later, and it's the most efficient one there is, because nobody suspects it. It doesn't arrive as a tragedy. It arrives as a reasonable, almost wise promise. Later, when things settle down. Later, once I've solved this problem. Later, once I earn a bit more. Later, once I'm ready. Later, once this phase passes. And the cruelest part is that each of those sentences sounds mature, sounds responsible, sounds like the right decision of a sensible adult. But now I want you to do something uncomfortable with me. Think about how many times that later has already moved in your life. You waited for a phase to pass, and it passed, and you didn't do it. You waited to earn more, and you did, and you kept waiting. You waited to be ready, and you never were, because nobody ever is. Notice that later isn't a point on the calendar. It's a place that moves every time you get close to it. And that's how a person spends 15, 20 years believing that real life is still going to begin, when the truth is that it began a long time ago, and it's happening now, exactly while you wait. And Nietzsche had a name for the way out of this, an expression that sounds simple and is the hardest thing in the world. Amor fati, the love of one's own fate. The idea is to stop spending your life wishing your story had been a different one. And look how interesting, because an enormous part of our daily dissatisfaction doesn't come from what's happening. It comes from that resistance to what already happened. We wish we'd made a different choice, wish we'd met someone else, or met the same person at a different time. Wish we'd started earlier, noticed that thing while there was still time, said what we didn't say. And that wish is completely useless in the most literal sense of the word, because life doesn't happen again the way we'd like. It only happens from here forward, always. Amor fati isn't pretending the past was good. It isn't saying that the loss was a blessing in disguise, and anyone who says that to a grieving person is being cruel. It's something else. It's ceasing to spend the present fighting with what is already closed. Because every minute spent in that fight is a minute taken from the only place where you can still act. Stop with me for a second here, because what we've just talked about is the kind of thing that changes someone's course. And I'm almost certain there's a person in your life who needs to hear it today. Think of them now. Someone who has been waiting for the right moment for years. Someone who talks about starting over and never starts over. Someone who lost a person and got stuck on that day, fighting something that doesn't come back. Or someone who's been dimmed, moving through the days on autopilot, unable to explain the emptiness. Send this video to them now, before you continue, And I ask that for a simple reason. Sometimes a person doesn't need strength. They just need a new perspective arriving at the right moment. You won't solve anyone's life with a video, and I won't pretend you will. But you can put an idea in someone's head, and ideas change decisions, and decisions change years. Besides, something happens to whoever sends it. When you send these words to another person, you're telling yourself that you believe them. And then it becomes much harder to keep postponing your own life. And now I want to return to what I asked of you at the very beginning, because only now do you understand its size. Remember I asked you to write in the comments what you've been putting off until things settle down? If you wrote it, look at what happened. You took your later out of the dark and put it in the light, where it's no longer comfortable. It now has a name, a shape. It's written on a screen where other people can see it. And that changes everything, because a named thing makes demands. If you haven't written it, go down now and write, because this is the only gesture in this video with an immediate practical consequence. And then do the second part, the one that multiplies. Find someone who is putting off exactly the same thing you are, and write to that person just this: me too. Let's stop putting it off together. 4 words. Because here's something nobody tells you about postponement. It feeds on isolation. As long as you think you're the only one stuck, you feel weak. When you discover there are 200 other people stuck in exactly the same place, and one of them replied to you, it stops being a personal failing and becomes something you can face. And now I want to go back to that man from the beginning, because we can finally look at the scene with new eyes. Remember him? The condemned man who knew the exact day of his own death, and who, even so, drank his coffee while it was hot. At the start of this video that seemed absurd, almost a bad joke. Why eat if everything is going to end in a few hours? But now you have all the pieces, and the scene inverts completely. He drinks the coffee because he's still here, because it's hot, because the bread still has taste, because that morning, even being one of his last, is still a morning of his life, and nobody took that from him. He doesn't need to defeat death for that moment to matter. He only needs to live it before it passes. And here's the truth I've been building with you throughout this entire video. We are in exactly the same situation as him, with one single difference. We don't have the date written on a calendar. And it's precisely because of that, and not in spite of it, that it's so easy to imagine there's still time to spare. Time to talk later, visit later, resolve later, start later. But nobody knows how much later they really have. And now let me bring all of this down to tomorrow morning. Because no philosophy is worth much if it only works while we're discussing grand questions. Life doesn't happen on that elevated plane. Life happens when you wake up with no desire to wake up. When you have to work even though you're tired. When someone you love calls and you're in the middle of something else. When you make your coffee, finish a boring task, or suddenly notice that an entire afternoon passed faster than you'd have liked. That's where everything we discussed today gets tested, not in a beautiful late-night reflection. So tomorrow, do one single thing. One. So this doesn't become theory. Pick one moment of your ordinary day and live it fully, without a screen, without hurry, without being mentally somewhere else. It could be the coffee. It could be 5 minutes of conversation with someone in which you truly listen instead of waiting your turn to speak. It could be the walk home, looking out instead of scrolling. Just one moment. Because the difference between being alive and being present is exactly that, and it's trained in small doses, on an ordinary day like tomorrow. So let me gather up everything we crossed through today, because it was a lot and I want you to take it organized. Camus showed that there's a collision between our hunger for explanation and the silence of the world, and that in the face of that. The way out is neither to give up nor to invent a false answer, but to keep living with your eyes open. Then we knock down that belief that something has to last in order to have value, and saw that it's precisely the opposite. It's the limit that gives weight to what we do. Frankl inverted the question. Instead of waiting for what life has to offer you, ask what it's demanding of you now, because it's in the answer that meaning is born. Sisyphus taught us that even when the boulder is inevitable, the climb is still yours. Epicurus showed that we suffer more in imagination than in reality, and the Stoics turned the remembrance of the end into a ruler for measuring what really deserves our time. And Nietzsche pointed to the love of one's own fate, which is ceasing to fight what's already closed so you can act where you still can. That's the map. And all of it points in a single direction. The direction is this. The question was never how to live without losses, without mistakes, or without an end. That life doesn't exist, never existed for anyone, and nobody honest will promise it to you. What matters is what you do with the time you have. It's in that time that you meet people, make mistakes, learn something, love, lose, build, change your mind, and start over. And none of it has to last forever to have been important. I'm also not going to pretend that a philosophy solves everything. You'll still be disappointed, you'll still lose people, you'll still have days when everything seems too small or completely meaningless. And no thought eliminates that kind of pain entirely. But it can change the place you look from. And if at some point that weight becomes too heavy to carry alone, if the pain moves from discomfort to something that steals your will to continue, please seek out someone prepared to listen to you, a professional, a support service, someone you trust. Asking for help contradicts nothing we talked about today. It's exactly what Frankl would call responding to what life is demanding of you right now. So, to close, 3 quick things. First, if you haven't written it yet, go down and write in the comments what you've been putting off, and reply to someone who's putting off the same thing with those 4 words, me too. Let's stop putting it off together. That isn't engagement, it's the only part of this video with a real consequence in your week. Second, share these words with the person you thought of, because a new perspective arriving at the right moment changes more than we imagine. And third, if this video made sense to you, leave your like and subscribe, because that's how it reaches whoever is awake right now asking exactly the same questions. And before you go, don't close it yet. The videos appearing on your screen continue this conversation. And take this with you. You can spend your entire life without finding a great answer about why you exist, and still choose to be present for someone, to finish something that matters, to change what no longer makes sense, or to say the thing you've been putting off. In the end, that's what we have. A span of time nobody can measure, a few people we met along the way, and a few choices we can still make. The end will arrive on its own. Until then, there's life before it.